Before you watch today's episode, we want to remind you that tickets are on sale for the Newsagents live shows with HSBC UK. We're kicking off our tour at the Birmingham Symphony Hall on February the 17th. Then we're off to the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester the following week on the 24th. And finally, the Usher Hall in Edinburgh on March the 11th. Head over to Global Player to get your tickets for any of these dates. The link will be in the description below. And we're very excited to see you there.
The last thing I wanted was to go against David Cameron or the government. But after a great deal of hard take, I don't think there's anything else I can do. I will be advocating vote leave.
That was the bombshell moment that Boris Johnson came out against the government of David Cameron as a backer, a supporter of Brexit. And in the words of David Cameron, later became an ambassador for the expert trashing, truth-twisting age of populism. David Cameron's words in his own memoir. What would have happened if of those two speeches, now so famous, Boris Johnson had chosen the column that backed Remain? Where would we be now? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And this is our New Year's What If.
Happy New Year.
Festive what if.
And also, have you noticed, Maitlis?
Ties.
Ties.
Well, because it's New Year.
Very
Very
nice.
formal.
Hang on. But we're not going to carry on this throughout 2025.
I'm going to get more formal as the year goes on. I'm going to end up in a ruff by
Ties
December.
are back. Ties for 25.
Ties are back.
Yeah.
Ties are back.
Garters.
Yep.
Garters.
Velvet.
All the rest of it.
Yep.
Smoking jacket. So you're going to become Oscar Wilde, really.
Already there, John. Way ahead of you, mate.
So we've got to start with that moment that Boris Johnson comes out of the House. He has written 2 columns for the Daily Telegraph, one arguing the case for why we should remain in the European Union, the other why we should leave, and he goes, ip, dip, thruppity bit, you are not it. Well, he doesn't. He says, well, I kind of came to the conclusion that, the most intellectually rigorous argument was that we should leave the European Union. But how would history have been different if Boris Johnson had gone the other way and said, no, Britain's future is best served by remaining in the European Union?
And we should say that this, it seems now when we look back, because Johnson became so sort of like a talisman of Brexit, sort of talismanic of it, and an embodiment of it, so it seems inevitable that he would do so. It didn't feel inevitable at the time. And indeed, because it was generally thought, although of course Boris Johnson had a long pedigree as a Eurosceptic, he had made his name in the 1990s as a young political reporter based in Brussels, doing stories, trying to find the word for it, doing certain stories that lots of people in Brussels would not have recognised about the European Union. But he made his name with all stuff, bendy bananas and all this sort of stuff, sort of writing quite comically about the excesses of EU regulation. So he had a long pedigree on that. But it was generally thought by David Cameron and Number 10 that although he would lean into Euroscepticism when it suited him, that he was a Remainer, that he didn't actually think we should leave the EU. Had a very cosmopolitan European type background, lots of different reasons. And Cameron
had been like that during his 2 terms as London Mayor.
Yes,
when he'd
Mr.
been
Liberal.
very welcoming.
And he was still
of
there
immigration.
when he made. We said when he actually made that intervention, he was still at the very tail end of his mayoralty. So he had been this sort of more liberal conservative figure, often criticising the government for being insufficiently liberal on all sorts of matters. So it felt like a very live question. And indeed, David Cameron, he's since talked about this. David Cameron put enormous amounts of effort and political capital trying to persuade him, including over apparently lots of games of tennis, which he says he let Johnson win, trying to persuade him to back Remain because they thought it would be so damaging for the Remain campaign if Johnson backed Leave, which of course he did.
It was in February of 2016, and you'll remember that the whole year started with David Cameron having gone off to petition Merkel and other EU leaders, please give us something that we can take back as a government to the British people. Can I sell them our remaining status in the EU because you've allowed us, particular priorities, particular concessions to the UK? And Merkel and others had said at the time, we can't move on freedom of movement. We can't give you any more concessions. Britain's already got this very favourable, very privileged position inside the EU. And so David Cameron came back with a sort of pitiful offering of change. And it was pretty much a month later, it was February of 2016, that Johnson endorsed the vote leave. the out campaign. And what happened at that point was the financial markets then realised that this whole shift would make Brexit more probable, and the pound slumped nearly 2% against the US dollar. So interesting when you look back to think, there was something that the markets saw then that we could only sort of feel in the political waters. They thought it was already going to be more probable, and that a more probable Brexit made the pound instantly weaker.
The other thing about it was, of course, that Johnson was this unique figure in British politics, and he was sort of more Trumpian than anyone else in British politics.
Before there was a Trump on the scene.
Before there was a Trump on the scene. I mean, Trump was kind of going for the Republican nomination at roughly the same sort of time. Boris Johnson reached the parts of the British electorate the old Heineken ad, that other politicians could not reach. And I think that was the realisation of the markets, that if you've got Boris Johnson against you, David Cameron had a big problem. And I think it was a really significant moment in the whole Brexit debate. Now, you could argue that maybe people would have come back to a referendum again and again, and if people had voted to remain. But it probably did make the difference.
Well, I think that it did a few things. Partly because Johnson was at that time a more popular figure than he later became, a less controversial figure. I think Cameron and Osborne, who, as I say, desperately tried to persuade him not to do it, correctly intuited that if Johnson, and also Michael Gove, and we shouldn't forget Gove's role in this as well, because he was the other sort of big person who came out in favour of it, if they had persuaded both of them, or even just one or other, but especially both of them, as they desperately tried to do, to back Remain, and even if they didn't campaign very much for it, what would it have left? What it would have left on the Leave side would be a situation that was very similar to the referendum in 1975. Because in the referendum of 1975, which we had, which was not called Remain Leave, but it was yes, no, it was basically the Leave side was bereft of mainstream political figures who could lead them. Who were the leaders of that campaign in 75? It was Enoch Powell and Tony Benn. Two figures that, although they were charismatic and towering figures in lots of ways, were very eccentric figures in British politics. What we had in 2016 was a situation where you had two leading mainstream figures who came out and legitimised the Leave campaign. It could not be said, as it was in 75, and as Cameron hoped to repeat the trick as Wilson pulled off in 75, it could not be said that this was a kind of sort of out there fringe pursuit, because it would have been led. Who would it have been led by in 16? It would have been led by Farage. And Farage, although we know politically skillful in lots of ways, is a far more Marmite figure and would have repelled as many as he attracted.
Or Gove. I mean, I was reading back through David Cameron's memoirs actually at the time, and he is so vitriolic about that moment. He is so clear-sighted about it. He calls Gove a foam-flecked Farageist. And he says that one quality shone through: disloyalty. Disloyalty to me, and later disloyalty to Boris. That's the prism, obviously, through which the UK Prime Minister would see all this, which is two senior members of your cabinet and pretty personable figures. And actually, one of them had been a very close friend of David Cameron's. We know there was a sort of godparent sort of link between the Goves and the Camerons. And I think at that point, he saw what Boris Johnson was doing, which was nothing to do with the politics of the time, nothing to do with the Remain or Leave arguments of the time, all to do with Boris Johnson's personal ambition. Now, the question, I guess, is, if Boris Johnson hadn't come out for Leave, but Gove had, and Gove has intellectual heft in this argument, could he have swayed it anyway? In which case, it wouldn't have been... I mean, that's the argument that Cameron makes, is that he thinks Boris did it to stop Gove getting the Conservative crown. In other words, one or other of them would have gone on to lead the Conservative Party under Leave, and it would either have been Boris or it would have been...
And George
Gove.
Osborne has said that since as well. He says that the actual real seminal moment was Gove, because Gove came out first. It was clear that Gove was going to do it, and therefore that made Johnson suspicious and believe that Gove would try and angle to be the sort of
which has nothing to do with Leave or Remain. It's all to do with the crown of the Conservative
Although,
Party.
to be fair to Gove, I think he had a far longer, really established pedigree as a Eurosceptic. I mean, that's why I could never understand Cameron. I mean, I suppose because he was closer to Gove, so he felt it more personally. But to be fair, Gove, I mean, clearly Johnson is a chameleon. Yeah, Johnson is a chameleon, but Gove had always felt it. So, Cameron was the
But
one
I
who
think
asked
the
the
thing
question.
that
Gove
shocked
didn't
him-
want there to be a referendum in the first place.
Yeah, but the thing that shocked him about Gove and later about Johnson was how quickly they adopted the lies of the Farages.
Well, they
as he
started
said.
to attack Cameron personally.
And they talked about Turkey joining the EU. They talked about the open borders that would mean that, 5 million Turks came in, which was complete rubbish. Penny Mordaunt later repeated it on the Sunday morning show with Andrew Marr. And I think that was the point where if you can sort of pinpoint the sliding away of truth, the sort of erosion of what we came to think of as fact-based argument, and it was replaced by emotion-based fear-mongering, it was then.
We talked on one of the other What If episodes about if Scotland had voted for independence. And we talked there about how the SNP manifesto for independence was thoroughly costed, utterly detailed. It works according to if we get this as the oil price and that. And here you had the Brexiteers doing the complete opposite. That say as little as possible, make up numbers about how much extra would go into the health service or what benefits would be brought, or we'd be able to enjoy all the benefits.
Because nobody can test you on that.
But
We don't know. We don't know.
Don't know. It's hypothetical. We'll be able to join all the benefits of the single market without any of the drawbacks.
Yeah.
Well, really? And I think they got away with an enormous lie. And Boris Johnson was the perfect vehicle for telling that.
Yeah.
So I do believe that he made a huge difference on this what if question.
Well, I mean, look, the margin was 1.3 million votes, right? So you only need 650,000 to go one way, to go the other way, to switch, and you've got a Remain result. So it doesn't seem incredible at all to believe that if Johnson, who did become, he was the salesman, he was the kind of the person who ended up leading it, it doesn't seem inconceivable at all that he could have swayed it. But then again, when it's that close, you can say any number of things might have swayed it. I mean, I think thing is about what Cameron says about Gove and Johnson, I think there is a bit of displacement activity there, to be honest, because I think Cameron was pretty naive to believe that a referendum which had basically the Tory party had been agitating for, and the Eurosceptic wing of his party had been agitating for year after year after year, for him not to believe that in some way that would not descend into the most acrimonious civil war. He's since said, I couldn't believe there were so many blue on blue attacks. Hello? For some of these people, this was the political fight of their lives. They couldn't care less about you and your premiership and what happens. Once he'd opened that
And it was
Pandora's
bigger than the
box,
Conservative Party.
and it was bigger for them than the Conservative Party, exactly. So I think that there was an element of that was always inevitable. And Cameron made lots of choices which could have changed the result or put him in a better position to win, but he didn't do specifically because he wanted to protect his premiership in the Conservative Party. He could have, for example, played it longer. He had given himself all the way until 2017 to have that referendum. He didn't want to do so because he didn't want it to consume his premiership. Well, we know how that turned out. He could have allowed there to be more ferocious attacks on the Leave side and Gove and Johnson, but he didn't want to because he didn't want to exacerbate the problems of the Conservative Party. He could have let 16-year-olds vote, but he didn't do so because he knew it would piss off his backbenchers. So Cameron has any one of those things could have changed the game, just like Johnson.
And there was basically, if you were to compare and contrast the two campaigns for Remain and Leave, Leave's slogan, Take Back Control, was a winner. Yeah. And the Remain campaign, to a large extent, was Project Fear. If we do this, or we're going to lose that. Yeah. And you're trying to frighten the voters.
I also think that despite, what we think of as a very narrow margin, there was clearly a movement and there was clearly unrest in this country, which you cannot bottle back up, right? And given everything we've now seen in Europe, given everything we've now seen in America, to suggest that the Brexit vote sort of hung on a Boris thread, I think is probably naive. I think it's slightly
big forces at work.
I think it was bigger than everything. As we always talk about on this show, the idea of the financial crash, the idea of trust in institutions, the idea that people hadn't actually seen their incomes materially increase, their children's welfare materially increase from their own, that was always going to be there. Whether the answer was Brexit, I mean, I think many people in this country still don't think that the answer was Brexit, but the anger and the desire to break, I think, was clearly in that result and has stayed with us for the next 10 years, right?
Look, it's a personal failure of David Cameron's. I would argue, with the exception of Blair, who did talk about the advantages of Europe, we have had a succession of prime ministers,
Yeah,
major...
but Blair also opened the gates to immigration.
Yes.
I mean, arguably the biggest
Sure.
cause of all this of all.
Which biggest mistake? But he did speak about the advantages of being part of the EU, whereas John Major kind of was, kind of carping about Europe, even though he was part of Remain. Gordon Brown was very similarly kind of, often very cross with Brussels. It's not surprising that the British people they'd been fed a diet of hostility towards what was happening in the European Union.
But that's what I mean about Cameron's strategic mistakes, in a sense that, remember, Emily, you mentioned the renegotiation. The absurdity of Cameron's position was that literally right up until February 2016, when he secured the end of that negotiation, you remember what the government line was? His line was, if he wasn't happy enough with the outcome of the renegotiation, he himself might lead the Leave campaign. Right? But then literally the next day is turning around to the British public and going, it is of existential importance that we stay in the EU. Those two things just don't add up. You can't be saying on one day you might lead us to leave, and the next day say this country's basically finished if we don't stay in. It just didn't make any sense. So I think a lot of the strategic problems were his.
Yeah, but I guess the question is, if you had been too much of a backer of the EU, would that have driven people away? Because they would have said, oh, he's just part of the establishment. He's just one of the same. They're all talking the same language. They don't understand it. He had to position himself, I guess, as being the person who understood both sides.
But he did that more for the politics of his own party rather than the politics of the country, I think. Because he always... I think that ultimately, remember as well, I actually think when we look back, when we say 52-48 and what a shock, partly because what you were just saying, Emily, in some ways when I look back now we can see the sort of big sweep of everything that's going on. I'm amazed it was that close.
Yeah.
I'm amazed it was that close.
I agree.
Actually, people say about Project Fear, whatever. Actually, I think they probably ran a pretty bloody good campaign in some ways. When you put it now in the sweep of things and you see it as part of a pattern, and maybe, that's contingency.
We were ahead. I mean, the question is, we were ahead on that. And did we open the gates then for everyone else?
Yeah.
If we hadn't gone through with Brexit, would Trump have had the same success, 6 months later? Would we have still seen the strength of Marine Le Pen? Blah, blah, blah. I mean, we just don't know. Did we somehow liberate, populations all over the world to go, let's give it a try?
Well, Scotland was the outlier. You mentioned about Scotland in a way. When we look back on all of these events now, Scotland is the outlier, not Brexit. Brexit's part of the pattern.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the fact of the matter is that if you want to be judgmental about this, it's not.
And when are we not?
And when are we not? It's not exactly. It's not that Boris Johnson decided in the end he wanted to support Brexit. It was that Boris Johnson decided he wanted to support Brexit because it was best for Boris Johnson and his chances of becoming the next Prime Minister. And it worked.
And if you think about it, let's just say, for the sake of argument for a moment, that actually, in his heart of hearts, he was a Remainer and he thought Remain would win, which is what Cameron has since said, that he texted him saying that, Brexit will get crushed by, I can't remember the sort of colourful metaphor, but it will be crushed. What an astonishing... If you leave aside kind of the rights and wrong with it, that is astonishing. I mean, that is astonishing that he might be able to sit there and say, I endorse something I didn't believe of titanic importance to this country, where I myself might have made the difference, and I did it for myself.
Okay, I'm going to just flip that on its head, which is really weird. But supposing there was something in Boris Johnson which said, there is a groundswell of this, and I can lead it. And it doesn't really matter what I think. It doesn't really matter what my views are as a Remainer or a Leaver.
Which is very true.
If he tapped into something that was felt by the majority of the people, maybe you could argue that's what politicians do. They listen to the electorate. I don't know.
But it is unusual for politics. That's the thing. People always assume that politicians are like that they're cynical, that they'll go where the electorate is. But actually, as we know, most politicians are not like that. They're actually quite inflexible about what they believe.
It depends whether you want ideology or whether you want
political success.
Somebody to listen. I don't know. I mean, do you want an ideologue?
We're not being judgmental now. We're actually being very understanding.
I think it's because I had a drink this lunchtime.
It's New Year.
It'll never happen again.
I hadn't noticed.
We will be back with more What Ifs just after this.
It's Elisa from Quebec City. I'd love to hear Emily in particular, no offense boys, on Hong Kong and the paths not taken around handover. Is there a world where Hong Kong's democracy and independence could have been better protected from China? Or, to fit your format, what if handover hadn't happened? Also, I'd like to be one of your legion of fans to say thank you for your hard work. Your voices are the first I want to hear on any subject, and I look forward to your episodes every day or night through sleep training and all. All right, that's enough fangirling. Merci beaucoup. Gros bisous. Bye.
I love that. I love that. And I love to feel that we're reaching parts of Quebec City that I never knew we did.
There we go.
There we are. That was fabulous.
Well,
Go on, Maitlis.
Emily.
They don't want to hear from Lewis or me.
No, I mean, I guess the question that Elise is asking is there any world in which Hong Kong wouldn't have been handed back to China? And in my life, that was never a question. Because, I went out to Hong Kong in 1992 when it was already on the cards. And it was like the salt timer, the egg timer, where we just watched the sands ticking down for 5 years
We should
until
say
the
to people
date.
younger who might not remember,
Yeah.
there was a 99-year lease from the UK.
I mean,
to the
basically,
Chinese
where do you want to
government.
start? Yeah. The Brits gained Hong Kong 170 years ago. It was through the Opium Wars. It was, all the stuff that we now loathe and hate and talk about, which is sort of the colonial powers, and which involved actually, addiction through opium. It was everything that you don't want. But interestingly, after 45, there was a question of whether Taiwan would take Hong Kong. And actually, the Brits then sort of won it back and carried on ruling. And it was only in the 80s that this whole question of delivering Hong Kong back began. And
It's like literally your leasehold running out on your flat.
it's like your leasehold
the
running out.
freeholder takes it back.
But the person that you're giving it back to is an autocratic communist regime. And so the discussions began in the 1980s, the sort of 84, 85 was where they started to build together what was called the basic law, this sort of the premise of the joint declaration. The joint declaration, I think, was 84 or 85, which was how we're going to handle this. And it was all very civilized. We're going to do this and we're going to make it a special administrative region. And they coined this phrase, one country, two systems. In other words, China is going to kind of own Hong Kong, but Hong Kong is going to have its own freedoms, it's going to have its own freedoms to make money, it's going to have its own democracy, all the rest of it. And then in the middle of this was 89, was Tiananmen, right? Which was the massacre of 2,000 people after the farmers' marches turned into the student marches, turned into the riots, and everyone remembers Tank Man, the guy who bravely stood in front of the tank. And you have this absolute in-your-face clash of cultures, which is, what the hell are we doing? Do we really want to deliver Hong Kong back to this killing machine that is China? And John Major famously was, I think, the first foreign leader that turned up in Beijing. It was a bit like the Nixon in China thing, who came after Tiananmen to kind of go, we're going to calm this down, we're going to sort of soften the waters. Chris Patten, who was the last governor of Hong Kong, who moved out at the same time as I did. I like to think he followed me, but it may have been the other way around.
You should have been governor.
Yeah, exactly. And Chris Patten was, as you know, I mean, you just spoke to him a couple of weeks ago, was so energised about this question of giving the Hong Kong people not just the chance to escape in the form of a passport, but their rights, the knowledge of how to protest, how to get out on the streets, how to fight for democracy. Every time there were protests against him, he was like, I'm delighted. If they know how to fight me, they will know how to fight the Chinese. As it turns out, the umbrella protest of 2014 was the first big showdown between China and Hong Kong, and it was brutal and it was horrible.
And he
I was-
famously wept.
Yeah.
Patton, of course, in 97.
History is not just a matter of dates. What makes history is what comes before and what comes after the dates that we all remember. The story of this great city is about the years before this night and the years of success that will surely follow it.
There was
kind
a
of
drop
last
on his
moment.
nose.
Yeah.
It was a very funny moment because it was
Oh,
terrible
bucketing.
weather. It was bucketing
there?
down. I was there,
Wow.
and I remember the scene so well because there was a raindrop on his nose, and we couldn't work out if it was tears or weather, and probably both.
And were people
I was-
dreading it at the time? Sorry, I was just because very intrigued. But were people, as the sort of sands sort of ticked down, were people dreading it there as it sort of
I mean,
got
it was
close
more
into
than
view?
dreading. I think people people were sort of hyperbolizing about it. So there were some people who imagined that on the 1st of July, the tanks would literally come rolling down from Beijing, into Hong Kong. And that, of course, was never going to happen. But the morning after, I was working for Channel 4 then, funny enough, with a cameraman called Ray. And the morning after the handover, we were sent to Governor's House, which was like, the Buckingham Palace of Hong Kong. And what I remember so clearly was the ER from the gates had already gone.
Right.
Yeah. So there were just these holes in the gate. It felt like a sort of coup, even though the whole thing had been planned. Everything to do with the monarchy, everything to do with the British government was slowly being eroded and wiped out.
So I was a political correspondent at Westminster at this period. And of course, the reason that Chris Patten was out there was that he'd lost his seat in the 92 election in Bath. And so John Major wanted to find a job for him, makes him governor of Hong Kong. And there was a feeling, Chris Patten sort of was at war slightly with the Foreign Office. Yeah. With the Foreign Office...
The Mandarins,
the Sinophiles in the Foreign Office. And there was a kind of... I think the ambassador at the time to China was a guy called Sir Percy Craddock, who was seen to epitomise the sort of... This is inevitable. There is nothing you can do about it. It is coming. Roll over and accept it. And I that's probably slight travesty of the view, and I'm simplifying enormously. And Patton's view was, we've got to fight to get the best deal possible so that we do preserve the system that makes Hong Kong this unique and vibrant place where, trading companies established and did really, really well and became this kind of vibrant beacon of Southeast Asia.
But the capitalism was always going to be preserved because China loved Hong Kong's capitalism. What it didn't like was the rule of law. What it didn't like was democracy. And I remember doing a story in the prison there. We got access to the prison. And I went to speak to 2 Nigerian prisoners who I think were there on, smuggling charges, probably drug smuggling charges, and they were fearing the death penalty. There was nothing that would stop China from commuting a sort of a 10-year sentence in a Hong Kong prison to a death penalty. Now, you might say, okay, I don't have a problem with that. That's how China operates, all the rest of it. But that was what we were up against. It was this idea that Britain had sort of delivered this very benign sort of caring, careful democracy with a rule of law, with checks and balances, with institutions in place. And China was just kind of like, well, we don't care about that. And the first elections after the handover were the thing that kicked off the umbrella protest because they said, yes, one person will vote. You can vote for anyone you like, but we've got to vet them first. And the people of Hong Kong were like, well, hang on a sec. We don't want to vote for your choices. We want to vote for our people. And that was what brought them onto the streets. And sorry, just this last thing, but I remember going back in 2014, the thing that broke my heart was being on the streets of Hong Kong and seeing girls in knee socks and check skirts and blouses and going, oh, that's funny. I wonder what all these protesters are, what are they wearing? They were school kids. They were 14-year-olds. They brought their homework down because they're all so hardworking. They didn't want to miss a day's school. They were protesting and doing their homework at the same time, wearing their school uniform, having lied to their parents and told them that they were all going to sleepovers at their friend's house. And they were protesting for the Hong Kong that they knew they were going to lose. And it was utterly heartbreaking.
So do you think there could have ever been another outcome? It's hard to know what Britain could have done.
I think that there is something that is post-imperial about, when kind of 2/3 of the globe was painted pink under the British Empire.
And at that time, China still had a smaller economy than we do. It's sort of hard to. The transformation of China.
But the direction of travel
was clear. Yeah.
Was clear that China was.
China was huge. The whole, Deng Xiaoping, who was the big figure of the 80s, kind of came up with this phrase, "Gaiga Kaifang," which was like the opening up. It's like, we're. I guess it's the perestroika, the glasnost of Gorbachev. It was like, we get it. We're going to remain communist, but guess what? We're going to make lots of money. Guess what they did? Right? Look at China. It's still made phenomenal amounts of money, and it's still kept an absolute iron grip on democracy, human rights, freedom of speech, and all the things that we kind of value here. The question, I guess, is, going back to Alyssa's thing, if the British government, if Major and Patten had been able to offer passports to people, I don't know. Would that have if and I don't for a moment think that we would have been
We've since offered enormous numbers.
Yes, but we've offered them as it were to asylum seekers, to
Yes,
people who are
yes.
now in trouble.
Yeah.
If we'd said 6 million passports, to come to the UK, it would have created a ruckus then. But most Hong Kongers, they don't want to come to to Britain. They want to go to Vancouver. They want to go to New York. They want to go to Boston. Half of the Tiananmen Square rioters just want to go and work for the Boston Consulting Group. They just wanted the chance to get out and make money. I mean, I guess the question is, if we had shown that we were prepared to rescue people, would Beijing have taken democracy more seriously?
I think the great political miscalculation in terms of the West and China is the belief that economic liberalisation would lead to political liberalisation.
100%.
That somehow, if you've got free markets operating...
Isn't that the lesson of our age, though? Do you remember the 2008 Olympics?
Yeah, I was there.
Okay, so wasn't the whole point of that is like, we're going to give this to China and then it'll all be fine.
Yeah.
It wasn't.
It wasn't.
It isn't.
The idea was that these, you would have economic growth, you'd have Western companies doing business, you would have Google, you'd have Facebook, you'd have all these companies operating, and they soon found that the Chinese government was saying, you must be bloody joking. We're not just going to have this free for all the citizens. And these companies thought, yeah, okay, that's the price of doing business. We'll accept it. We won't do anything.
And they control
about
the
it.
media,
And
they shut down
controlled the media.
Weibo, they stopped
so,
TikTok.
And so this whole, kind of presumption that if you had that, if you had the free markets, of course you're going to have democracy that will follow just a few steps behind. It didn't happen.
It didn't happen. At the time, though, you can understand why people might have believed it would happen, because it happened everywhere else.
Yeah.
But now we know it's not, doesn't and won't necessarily. And that means we do have to confront the fact that, let's be really honest, the rise of China, without doubt, particularly its economic strength, has been the story of the 21st century. And we accept it, and we partly accept it because we want cheap goods. We want what it has to offer.
I don't think it did happen everywhere else. I mean, it's really interesting that you say that, and I'm kind
Well,
of
if you
going
think of
through
the
my
breakup
head.
of the Soviet Union, you had the democracies of Slovakia and Slovenia and all the rest of it.
But if you look at the dare I say, the Eastern values, Singapore had Lee Kuan Yew, right? They used to lock people up for chewing gum offences, right? It was capitalist and it was draconian. It had Asian values. The same with Mahathir in Malaysia, Asian values. Whatever that meant, it was about a very, very tight rein on democracy, however much capitalism they allowed.
I suppose what I mean by that is that from the vantage point of the mid-90s and this, this great sort of this great kind of this great apogee of kind of liberal democracy, and obviously the famous stuff with Fukuyama, the end of history, didn't entirely mean by that, but this idea that basically liberal democracy had won out. It was the end point. And from that point and from that vantage point, there did feel, or at least for many people, and perhaps it was now always naive, but it did feel there was a kind of like Whiggish inevitability to all of this stuff, and that China would follow. What we can definitely say now, though, is that is not the case, and that there is those two things. That there is such a thing as illiberal democracy, and that
100%.
democracy, liberal. We put these words, liberal and democracy, together as if they're sort of natural bedfellows. Is not true.
Yeah,
you can have all sorts. Democracy is just a mechanism. The liberal bit is what we choose to have with it.
And coming up after the break, our last what if of this series.
Earlier today, I spoke with His Majesty the King to request the dissolution of Parliament. The King has granted this request, and we will have a general election on the 4th of July.
Not since Gene Kelly did Singing in the Rain has any man been as wet as Rishi Sunak was as he stood in Downing Street with the rain bucketing down and people just thinking, oh my God, why did you do that? And why did you do that there? And haven't you got a coat? And haven't you got an umbrella?
Or a plan.
So Ellis has asked, what would have been different if Rishi didn't call the election early? Do you think the Tories would have had any time to redeem themselves? And do you think Reform could have got even more of the vote share?
Interesting.
Nice one,
I
Ellie.
tell you what, I heard an interview given by Rishi Sunak's chief of staff, who makes the alternative argument that they should have gone a year earlier. That they should have gone way, way sooner than they did, that they hung on far too long, that you had the promise of change, and we're going to ask the British people to decide much earlier before the narrative was set of hopelessness and helplessness.
But wasn't the narrative set after Liz Truss?
It probably was. But then if you had run a campaign saying, look, we brought maximum distance, this was a disgrace, we're going to do things differently, and this is our plan for how we're going to make Britain a better place, you don't wait as long for the general election as they did when Rishi Sunak made a series of pledges like we're going to stop the boats, which it was patently obvious he wouldn't be able to.
I think that, they think that lots of stuff would have come out over the summer and that, it would have just been a different thing. I mean, I think it's fair to say, actually, the argument always was that the economy might improve. As we've seen at the moment, the economy is not particularly improving. It depends whether you blame Labour for that rather than anything the Tories might have done. Obviously, the big difference might have been that Farage did not get back into the game because there was a possibility that Farage was over in the United States. If you'd had the election in, say, November, which is what everyone assumed it would be, that Farage would have been off campaigning for Trump and therefore wouldn't have got back into the game. So there is at least a possibility that Farage decides not to, never mind reform vote share going up, that Farage isn't there at all.
I guess it depends what you think has happened to this country since July, doesn't it? And whether all of that, any of that, can be laid at Labour's feet. I mean, immigration numbers, inflation numbers, economic figures. Has the dial moved enough to give us a different result? Or I suppose somebody like Craig McKinley, who we heard from a few weeks ago at the Spectator Awards. Craig McKinley, who was, this extraordinary figure who's lost both legs and both arms, and had come back through sepsis and had come back into the Commons to rapturous applause, and then suddenly found that he was, faced with an election. It was too difficult to fight too quickly. I think he would have stood. I think other people probably would have stood and hung on. I think there were people that the Tories would have kept hold of. I think their tally ultimately would have been bigger, but I don't think the result would have been different.
It couldn't have been much worse. It really couldn't.
Do you think?
I don't think so. I think
it couldn't have been much worse.
Yeah,
worse. Maybe they would have got 140, 150 seats instead of 120. Whatever.
It couldn't have been much worse. And of course, we could have still been. There was a universe where an election had been called next week because he could have had it as late as January the 30th.
How would we be feeling about that?
We wouldn't be sat here in our resplendent clothes, I'm sure. We'd be getting ready to hit the road.
I'm looking forward to a scruffier 2025, by the way.
Right.
Oh, is that right?
Nice clothes are out.
So wait, scruffy but with ties. Can I just check?
No.
So what are you going to be wearing, like a string vest?
Yeah, with my pot belly hanging over.
It's a bit of Stella Artois coming in here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm going to get inked, get a sleeve.
You're going to be like Geoffrey Hughes in Keeping Up Appearances.
Yes, whatever that is. Okay.
Great to get an early reference to Geoffrey Hughes.
So broadly, no. Wouldn't have made any difference.
I don't think it would have made
the
much
die
difference.
was cast.
I think
after
that
14 years, the year of 3 prime ministers, I think the Tories were done.
Yeah.
The only thing I'd say is that we all thought Rishi would be off to California in August. And fair play to him. He wasn't. He isn't. He's still around. He's still an MP.
We'll see about this August.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.